Welcome to Bunny Trails, a whimsical adventure of idioms and other turns of phrase. I'm Shauna Harrison.
And I'm Dan Pugh. Each week, we take an idiom or other turn of phrase and try to tell the story from its entry into the English language to how it's used today. Whatever the task that comes your way, just take it as part of your luck. Look it right square in the eyes and say, "This is my task, I'll do it today. Don't pass the buck." Oh, whether you cook or whether you fight, or whether you trundle a truck, just tackle your job and do it right. Don't pass the buck. The wheels of the earth have gone, alack, deep into war's mire and muck. And if you want to put it again on its track, don't shift your load on another man's back. Don't pass the buck. That was Passing the Buck by American author and poet Ella Wheeler Wilcox, written in the early 1900s, and I think it does a great job of using today's phrase. And according to the Oxford English Dictionary, pass the buck means, quote, to make a scapegoat or dupe of another person, to shift responsibility to another, end quote. And it's really that shift responsibility that we see quite a bit. Shauna, are you familiar with this phrase?
I am. I've heard this phrase before. I think I've heard it mostly for that shifting responsibility.
Yeah, same.
Not the scapegoat, but that's interesting. So.
Well, you got the one spot where you're like, I'm not going to take action on this, right? That's the shifting responsibility. But it can also be used in that I'm going to intentionally pass the buck to the other person so that they have to deal with it. And that's the scapegoating way. I think a lot of it is determined by how someone is passing the buck. Are they intentionally doing it to make the other person take the blame? Or are they intentionally doing it to avoid having to do it themselves, right? So, and I think it could go either way, and sometimes it does turn out to be both, but I think that's why the two definitions are linked in that way. So one thing we can be relatively sure of is this phrase does not arise from the colloquial reference to the United States' $1 bill. In fact, no one is quite sure why we call the U.S. dollar bill a buck, but there are some theories, and we will explore those in our behind-the-scenes video, available every Friday on our Patreon, as patreon.com/bunnytrailspod. But for our phrase, pass the buck, it comes from poker, which means our phrase has two lives. The first, in poker, the literal usage of pass the buck, and the second, as we know the phrase today. Shauna, did you know that this came from poker?
Not at all.
I also did not when I began researching it. I really thought it was the dollar bill, like pass a dollar bill. I really thought it was that, and turns out it is absolutely not. But spoiler alert for those in the behind the scenes, why we call a U.S. dollar bill a buck. One of the theories is it comes from the phrase "pass the buck." So we're not sure of that, but that is one of the predominant theories. There's three big ones, and we'll talk about them. But in poker, it's really difficult to know how this was originally meant. I found many sources that said the buck was an item that showed who the dealer was. So basically it was just a tangible item, but it didn't matter what it was, inanimate object of some sort. Like you just said, a knife or something, and whoever that knife was in front of was the dealer, right? But not a single place that made that claim also provided any evidence to back it up. And furthermore, the evidence that I could find, which we'll get to soon, indicated that this explanation doesn't go far enough back into poker's history to explain the origins. So while it may be factually correct as one step in this phrase that maybe a buckhorn knife was used as passing around, and that's what indicated when you pass a dealer, you pass the buck, but that is definitely not enough because the evidence is quite lacking, and it is likely not the origin because we do have contemporary accounts of what the buck does mean in that time frame. And I think some of this is just a backwards understanding of how we play poker today versus how poker was really played in the 1800s.
Gotcha.
So we're going to look at the poker term in The Conquest of Kansas by Missouri and Her Allies, the history of the Troubles in Kansas from the passage of the Organic Act until the close of July 1856. The Organic Act in this case refers to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which divided the land immediately west of Missouri into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska. This is a several-hour history podcast all on its own, so we are not going to go into any more on that. But the work, The Conquest of Kansas and Missouri by Our Allies, was written by a correspondent of the New York Tribune, William Addison Phillips. And this was in 1856 when it was written. So effectively, the book covers June 1854 through December of 1856. And here's one passage from it. Quote, "Nothing occurs to distract us from our monotonous snail's pace, or attracts our attention save two dogs, who join us more from interest than glory. At last, Buck Creek appears. We think how gladly we would pass the buck at poker, but we are not playing that game now." End quote. So it's clear that Buck meant something to do with poker, though it's difficult to be sure exactly what. But this is 1854. I also thought it was interesting to use the phrase snail's pace in 1854.
Right.
So I wonder how old that phrase is. That might be a subject for a future episode. But in this case, he doesn't make it clear what Buck is, but clear that when he saw Buck's Creek, it made him think of playing poker because the term was already being used as a literal item, the buck. So perhaps the most definitive answer we can give on the word bucks in poker comes from this 1887 book, Game of Draw Poker by John William Keller. In it, Keller has an entire chapter titled The Buck. Keller says the practice of using a buck arose because some gamblers felt like the jackpot didn't happen often enough. And so they, quote, resort to the bold and ludicrous expedient of passing the buck. The buck is any inanimate object, usually a knife or pencil, which is thrown into a jackpot and temporarily taken by the winner of the pot. Whenever the deal reaches the holder of the buck, the new jackpot must be made. In this way, a jackpot is assured at least once in every round of deals, and the chances are that it will occur much oftener. While the use of the buck is ridiculous in the eyes of any scientific poker player, it is nevertheless productive of much amusement in the game when the chips are of nominal or small value. End quote. Oftener. Okay.
Oftener.
So, in the previous chapter, Keller discusses the relatively new invention of the jackpot, supposedly named because it could only be opened with a pair of jacks or better. In this case, all players put money into it before the draw. So before the jackpot, players would look at their hands and decide whether or not they even wanted to play. When we play poker now, it's pretty traditional that everybody antes in, right, to create that jackpot. But that wasn't the case in the early 1800s. They didn't have like that piece. So you got your cards and decided, oh, I don't want to play, and then you could just pass on it, right? And so this was kind of a big deal for people because people would decide whether they wanted to play or not. And with the optional jackpot rule, everyone would ante up before to even play, which would raise the reward for the eventual winner, which is how we normally play it now. But not everyone liked that idea because it was effectively an entry fee to play. In fact, Keller called it a tax to play. The buck came along to force a person to start a jackpot and thus giving them that responsibility to start the jackpot. So whenever you were the dealer, if that buck was yours, you had won the last one. When it got back to you, you had to start a new one. At some point between 1887 and now, it started to get associated with just the dealer instead. And so then you would just identify, okay, you're the dealer, and you would pass that along because everyone was anteing every time already anyway. That had really taken over.
Right.
So there you go. Clear as mud.
Yeah.
All right, so let's move onward to how it's used. Now, on this show, we usually follow a strict chronological order with these, but we're going to have to go backwards to 1874 to see the first time we find this phrase used figuratively outside of poker. This is from the Proceedings of the Grand Lodge of Free and Accepted Masons under the 1874 updates for the state of Massachusetts. It was referencing the goal of creating as many new chapters as possible. And it mentions that the Massachusetts chapter is now going to be turning over the leadership of one of these new chapters it helped create to its own members. Quote, "This, we take it, places the grand chapter of the District of Columbia entirely in the shade in regard to convocations. We were called the grand chapter of Murderous Convocations now." No, I think that's numerous. Whoa. Wow, murderous is a wild word.
That's so much.
Let's go back to this link and look. Numerous, yes, definitely numerous. Wowzers!
Okay.
Wow, that might have been I misspelled it so bad. Numerous. Okay, Here we go. Let's try this again. Quote, "This, we take it, places the Grand Chapter of the District of Columbia entirely in the shade in regards to convocations. We were called the Grand Chapter of numerous convocations. Now we will pass the buck." End quote. In this, no poker or gambling is being referenced. They are simply using a familiar term to indicate passing the responsibility on to the next group. But it's not in a scapegoaty way, right? They're not trying to like pass the buck so that someone else has to deal with it. This is a natural passing of the buck, passing of the responsibility, because those people are ready to take that on now. Here's an example from Mark Twain in his admittedly ludicrous recitation of a conversation. This is the recounting of Buck Fanshaw's funeral, and I'm pulling it from the 1885 publication Innocents at Home by Mark Twain. This conversation is between a rough miner and a newly arrived clergyman. I'll begin with Scotty the miner speaking to the parson. Quote, "Are you the duck that runs the gospel mill next door?" "Am I the... Pardon me, I believe I do not understand." With another sigh and a half sob, Scotty rejoined, "Why, you see we're in a bit of trouble, and the boys thought maybe you'd give us a lift if we'd tackle you. That is, if I've got the rights of it, and you're the head clerk of the doxology works next door." "I am the shepherd in charge of the flock whose fold is next door." "The which?" "The spiritual advisor of these little company of believers whose sanctuary adjoins these premises." Scotty scratched his head, reflected for a moment, and then said, "You rather hold over me, pard. I reckon I can't call that hand. Andy and pass the buck." End quote. So in this case, it's clear from the word ante that poker is being referenced, but it's a metaphorical usage and not a literal one. I also like this because Twain has, or Samuel Clemens, as his real name goes. So Clemens has taken this this thing that he supposedly overheard between a clergyman and a miner who were both speaking in their own languages, basically. And even though they were both speaking English, they were struggling to understand each other because the miner was speaking in such a colloquial, very slang-heavy way, and the pastor was doing so in such a learned way, and so they were just struggling to communicate with each other. Although it does look like it mostly worked out at the end, because they were hoping the parson would officiate at the funeral of their friend.
Right.
Now, I'll also be linking to a 1913 recitation of this story by Harry Humphrey, a comedian, and that has been captured for posterity in the United States' Library of Congress archive. So if you'd like to hear this whole story, then you can go to that link and check it out. Mark Twain was arguably one of the most well-read authors of his day. I don't mean he read a lot, although he did. I mean lots of people read his work. So his usage certainly would have helped introduce the terms to anybody who maybe didn't have an association with gambling. Though we didn't necessarily see a huge boost here, but people like Mark Twain using the phrase is going to keep it in circulation. Here's another example of the phrase being used and defined in the Birmingham Age Herald out of Alabama, USA, dated October 14th, 1906. Though it does note the article was originally published in the New York Sun, it is titled, "On Passing the Buck." Here are the opening sentences. Quote, "Passing the buck, Philip," said Mr. Greatbar, "as applied to our conduct in life, is a somewhat slangy and yet vigorous, and it must be admitted, no altogether infelicitous substitute for the form evading the responsibility. As used in this significance when we say of a man who has been confronted with some situation out of the ordinary that he passed the buck, we mean that he has evaded the responsibility of setting it himself and shunted it off upon somebody else." End quote. Okay, it is also very helpful when definitions are included so you know exactly what they meant by the phrase. But
Right.
I feel like Scotty the miner now with this guy using these fancy, really, I just feel like he said used so many words that were not necessary for me to understand the sentence to a point it almost became confusing. So Mr. Greatbar did. But
Right.
anyway, that's I guess the way they talked in New York at the time.
Little flourishy there on the
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
wording.
Here's a fun article from the Washington Herald out of Washington, D.C., USA, and this is dated September 28th, 1921. It is titled, "Men and Women Long on Passing the Buck, She Thinks," and it's by Dorothy Dix. Here's the opening paragraph of the article accusing parents of dodging their responsibilities. Quote, "The favorite indoor sport of most people is passing the buck, which means letting George do it, ducking your own responsibility, putting up to somebody else the disagreeable thing you are too lazy and cowardly to do yourself. Everybody does it, men as well as women, but it is a vice to which women are especially addicted. The chief reason why women get married is because they want somebody to whom they have a legal right to pass the buck, and they work the privilege for all it's worth." End quote. Yikes.
Like,
I think Dorothy is bitter about something.
yeah.
But she is using the phrase exactly as we've come to expect, giving the responsibility, and in this case, the blame, to someone else. So this is a good example of it being used as the scapegoat kind, not just the passing the responsibility, but you're passing it on. You're too lazy and cowardly to do it yourself, and you are putting it onto someone else so they have to deal with it, and they're going to take the blame and the fall for it.
Right.
I'm going to end this half of the show with a popular sign that was sent to United States President Harry S. Truman in 1945. And I think this is another reason why the phrase and phrases like it live on now, is because of the popularity here in the 1940s with this president. But it features another phrase that comes from Pass the Buck. Here is an excerpt from an article about the sign from the Truman Library online. Quote, "The sign, 'The buck stops here,' that was on President Truman's desk in his White House office, was made in the Federal Reformatory at El Reno, Oklahoma. Fred A. Canfill, then United States Marshal for the Western District of Missouri and a friend of Mr. Truman, saw a similar sign while visiting the reformatory and asked the warden if a sign like it could be made for President Truman. The sign was made and mailed to the president on October 2nd, 1945. The saying 'the buck stops here' derives from the slang expression 'pass the buck,' which means passing the responsibility on to someone else. On more than one occasion, President Truman referred to the desk sign in public statements. For example, in an address at the National War College on December 19, 1952, Mr. Truman said, "You know, it's easy for the Monday morning quarterback to say what the coach should have done after the game is over. But when the decision is up before you, and on my desk I have a motto which says 'the buck stops here,' the decision has to be made." In his farewell address to the American people given in January of 1953, President Truman referred to this concept very specifically in asserting that the president, whoever he is, has to decide. He can't pass the buck to anybody. No one else can do the deciding for him. That's his job. End quote. I also found it interesting that Truman used the phrase Monday morning quarterback in 1952. Now, we've done an episode on the phrase armchair quarterback, which was episode 236, where the phrase originated from rugby, not American football. We didn't talk about Monday morning quarterback there, but I remember looking into it at the time, and it seems to have been around since the 1930s and is about American football. All right, so up next, we have several modern uses to cover, and we'll get to those right after we say thank you to our sponsors.
This episode is brought to you by our amazing patrons on Patreon, and it is 100% free to join the Bunny Trails community. So give our weekly discussions and poll questions a try. And if you love the content and want more of it, we have some paid tiers too if you have a few dollars to spare each month and want to support the show.
We have new things every weekday on the feeds. In addition to the conversation about what movies, shows, books, and podcasts everyone is enjoying, and our weekly poll questions, we also have early access to the week's podcast, all the links, books, songs, and other content mentioned in the week's episode, and our lightly edited behind-the-scenes video featuring all of the cut content, goofs, and bonus facts that didn't make it into the podcast feed.
We've also got original digital artwork every month made by me and direct access to talk with us. No nefarious social media algorithms getting in the way of what we see or don't see. Plus, you can get awesome name recognition like Pat Rowe and JGP do every episode. And our top spot is currently occupied by the amazing Mary Halsey Lopez. You can join the Bunny Trails community for free at Bunny Trails Pod on Patreon. That's patreon.com/bunnytrailspod.
I'll start our modern uses with a song by Irving Berlin. The title does not include our phrase, what?
Oh, nothing. I was thinking that Irving Berlin didn't seem particularly modern, but
I do not
in
know
a
what
lot of
you're
ways,
talking about.
in a lot of
You
ways is.
are a baby.
Okay.
That's why, because you're a little bitty baby person who just got born yesterday. All right. I'll start our modern uses with a song by Irving Berlin. The title does not include our phrase, but it is part of the lyrics. And since this song was specifically written for my favorite Christmas movie, and since I'm the one writing this episode, I get to include it here. Gee, I Wish I Was Back in the Army was written in 1954 specifically for the film White Christmas. Here's an excerpt from the song. Quote, Gee, I wish I was back in the Army. The Army wasn't really bad at all. 3 meals a day, for which you didn't pay, uniforms for winter, spring, and fall. There's a lot to be said for the Army, a life without responsibility. A soldier out of luck was never really stuck. There's always someone higher up where you can pass the buck. Oh, gee, I wish I was back in the Army. End quote.
Do you have trouble reading lyrics sometimes?
Yeah,
and
without
not
singing them.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, yep, definitely. So pass the buck here is following our usage, and in this case, they're saying, you know, we get to. That's one of our rights is to be able to pass that responsibility up to somebody else. It's not necessarily that they're scapegoating that person, but they're not letting that person be scapegoated either. They're saying, I'm not going to be scapegoated for it. We could pass that right on up.
Right.
Passing the Buck, Federalism and Canadian Environmental Policy is a 1996 academic work by Catherine Harrison. Here's the last paragraph of the synopsis from the publisher. Quote, of particular importance to those in environmental studies, policy planning, political science, and law, Passing the Buck makes an original contribution to the literature of Canadian federalism and environmental policy. It is timely both in the light of growing awareness of environmental challenges facing Canada and its examination of how we and other countries around the world adapt and rearrange our political systems to cope with large-scale ecological change. End quote. All right, exciting work if you are someone who would be reading a book about federalism and Canadian environmental policy. So there you go. So next up, I want to use 3 examples that use the phrase in a mixed metaphor sense. That is, they use the phrase pass the buck, but they're referring to the United States dollar bill with pass the buck. In the popular TV game show Price is Right, there's a mini game called Pass the Buck. It originally aired in 2001, which was the Bob Barker era, and has continued on in the Drew Carey era. Here's how the game works from thepricesright.com. Quote, 2 grocery items are shown to the contestant, each with a price. The contestant must pass a dollar bill to the price that is $1 too low. If correct, the contestant earns an additional pick from a game board. Once the contestant has earned their picks, they select numbers to reveal dollar amounts, a car, or the words lose everything. After each pick, the contestant may stop the game or risk their winnings to make another pick, end quote. So basically, I watched some clips of this. Basically, there are 2 items, and one of them is $1 less than it actually would be, and the contestant has to decide which one and pass a little wooden buck, dollar bill from one side to the other, and put it underneath the one that they think is $1 too short, and pass the buck over to it. So that's how it's being used there. Pass the Buck is a fun song about famous faces and places on American money. So that's a song and a book by Michael Dahl. The book was published in 2004. Here's the quick synopsis from the publisher. Quote, relates the reasons why certain historical places and people have been honored by being depicted on American coins and paper money, interspersed with the verses of original song lyrics to be sung to the tune of This Old Man, end quote. So there you go. I'm not going to give you any of those lyrics because I don't want it to be, that's just an earworm I wouldn't wish on anybody. But there you are. Pass the Buck is a short film by director Mark Perfetto. Here's the synopsis from imdb.com. Quote, a dollar bill is passed through people's lives from 1969 to the present, examining the social, economic, and political values as they literally and figuratively pass the buck, end quote. So in this case, they recognize they're literally passing a buck, right? Passing a dollar bill, but they're figuratively passing responsibility on as they go. So in this one, they're using it a little bit of both ways. I'm going to also link to the entire 18-ish minute film from the YouTube page of the director of photography on the project, Dave Spees. Okay, so let's jump back to our original usage of the phrase. This next one is the song Pass the Buck by the band Stereophonics off of the 2007 album Pull the Pin. Here's the chorus, quote, you don't know what it is you got. You don't know where you're going. You don't know what is right from wrong. All that you do is lie. So just get out of my life. You're passing the buck again. Just hold up your hand and take on the shame. Just get out. You're lying again. Take the blame. Get out of my life and be a man. End quote. So this is definitely a song about someone who is being passed the buck and feels like they are being scapegoated. And this person just continues to pass the buck to them. And this next one is difficult to tell the way the phrase is being used. Pass the Buck is a song by Brooks Robertson off of the album Into the Trees. The song was written and arranged by Lawrence Juber. It's an instrumental song featuring a fingerstyle acoustic guitar. I really enjoyed it, but I am a fan of instrumental acoustic arrangements. Other than the frame being used in the name, I couldn't find anywhere that gave an indication of what it meant, but it is our phrase showing up in popular culture, and I really liked the song, so I included it here. As an adult, I've never been one for passing the buck, but I love the phrase. It's a fun way to indicate just noping out on something and letting it be someone else's issue. But in real life, I live much closer to Ella Wheeler Wilcox's words, whatever the task that comes your way, just take it as part of your luck. Look it right square in the eyes and say, this is my task. I'll do it today. Don't pass the buck. That's about all the time we have for today. If you have any thoughts on the show or pop culture references we should have included, reach out to us on Patreon, patreon.com/bunnytrailspod, or comment on our website, bunnytrailspod.com.
It is poll time. Recently, we asked our patrons if you could trade lives with a fictional character for one day, who would it be? The results were pretty well split between a detective or spy, a fantasy hero, or a sci-fi explorer. JGP echoes everyone's thoughts here. This is difficult. She says, quote, oh, this is so hard to choose. Originally, I started to think of all the fantasy heroes who got to meet dragons because dragons are great and I'd love to see one. Except for this fact, usually meeting a dragon means fighting a dragon, which isn't so great. There's also so many amazing sci-fi explorers, and that would mean exploring space, except usually the characters in those also end up in protracted space battles and often either dying in them or having many crew members die. So I think I would want to be Nero Wolfe, who was a detective, but all his clients came to him, and he never did any of the legwork on his cases himself, so was never in danger. So I'd get to spend the day in a wonderful brownstone in 1930s New York City and have a personal chef. End quote.
That does sound pretty good. I like that idea. Litter Fluff adds, quote, I think Spence and Nightshade from Skyward would be my top pick. I like the idea of being a fighter pilot who also gets to go on crazy adventures through alternate realities in space. Plus, space magic. End quote.
Yeah.
I can think of versions of every option that I might choose, but I think I'd definitely go with sci-fi, specifically someone from Star Trek, because I'd want to explore space. Probably the person who leads away team mission, so I'm thinking Commander William T. Riker in Star Trek The Next Generation. That's probably who I'd pick.
Nice. Jan says, quote, fantasy hero for me, maybe Skeev from Robert Asprin's Myth series, or Death from the Discworld. I just like his attitude. End quote.
Death from the Discworld is a really good option.
Yeah.
I really like that idea.
I think I'd go with something fun and ridiculous like Q from Star Trek. He gets to
which
have,
which one?
like,
Which one? John Delancey
Yeah,
or
yeah.
was it Corbin Burson that played the other one?
John Delancey.
Yeah,
Not the uptight one, you know, the
John Delancey was
Delancey's
definitely
a little bit-
sometimes
a
uptight
little
about
bit
it.
uptight, but you know, whatever.
All right.
No,
So
no,
the Q, the one everybody's
idea.
thinking of when we say Q. Got it.
Yeah, because like he gets to have fun doing all sorts of mischievous things, but he can snap his fingers to undo it all, and he's never really in danger. Plus, it would be cool to go sit on the edge of a black hole and, you know, stroll through galaxies and stuff. So, anyway, if you want to take part in our silly polls, head over to the Patreon. We'd love to hear your take on our weekly poll questions, and it's free at patreon.com/bunnytrailspod. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week. Until then, remember,
Words belong to their users.